I'm recording.
Okay, welcome. Thanks, Aaron, for having this topic on. Today, as follow-up from previous webinar, we're going to focus on how silage is used and primarily delve into use in growing cattle, a little bit on beef cows, just how it works, and then some more details on feedlot cattle. Uh, and we have some economics on its use, at least especially on the feedlot side. So as we talked last time, I just want to rehash that how we price silage is really important, and our data suggests an appropriate price while it's in the field is 7.65 times corn price. But then what is that price when you get it to the bunker, and then finally what is it when it's delivered to the cattle? And that is what I guess the price of silage standing in the field is not dependent upon corn price because it's the same multiplier. But when you get to what the price is in the bunker or at the bunk, it is dependent upon absolute price of corn. For example, at $3 per bushel of corn, it's approximately 11 times the as-is bushel price for silage price as is in the bunker per ton, and that goes to 12.2 by the time you get it to the bunk with a 10% shrink. Those multipliers, if you will, of silage price per ton as is as a function of corn price per bushel as is goes down as the price of corn goes up. And so we'll go through some examples of that, at least on the feedlot side here at the end. The key issue when we're pricing this, which I want to reiterate from last week, is that we maximize yield of grain and the plant. If we don't, then the tonnage of silage that you remove is not maximized, and the economics don't work out the way we've described them. And so the cost of silage would increase if we don't maximize grain yield and silage yield at the time of silage harvest. The other thing I mentioned is that dry matter content, maybe we should be targeting black layer and 40% dry matter, which is a little higher than normal. I'm basing that a little bit on one study that's out there, and I think more work needs to be done on this. This was in the Journal of Dairy Science, and they looked at two different hybrids. And for example, for one hybrid at 1/3 milk line, it was 26% dry matter. 2/3 milk line, that dried down to 34% dry matter, and when you got to black layer, it was 38. And that silage worked well when it was put up in that study at all those different moistures and dry matter contents. But in the same study on a different hybrid, you can see that the dry matter contents were much greater as we went from 1/3 milk line to 2/3 milk line in the black layer. So it does appear to be hybrid, impacted some by hybrid, and we need to work more on that in the future. The other thing I want to mention, which has not been brought up, is it's common practice now to do what's called kernel processing at the time of silage harvest. And there's good data evaluating kernel processing in the dairy industry and dairy research on that. And I'm unable to find, unless I've missed it, any data available on beef cattle related to kernel processing. And I think that's a need in the future. Okay, so again, why we can talk about silage is because perhaps it's more competitive today. That's related a little bit to grain prices. But I would say regardless of grain price, we have a lot of interest in how we use residue because residue is abundant, and we think we want to use it better in the beef industry here in Nebraska. And then we think it fits well with distillers' grains, which is obviously common today, and so that's another reason to maybe look at it. Okay. So what I want to do is first talk about growing and finishing cattle, and a little bit about analysis and what the energy value is. I want to mention here that if, depending upon the cattle that you're feeding, if it's growing cattle, they're likely going to need protein supplementation if you want to maximize performance. Beef cows may or may not need protein supplementation depending upon the stage of production that they're in. And then before I get into a lot of more detail, I want to mention that silage is apparently an acquired taste by cattle. And so for new calves, I think there's evidence that suggests you want to adapt those new cattle, especially if they're freshly weaned calves, they may not take the silage right away. I don't know if it's because it's a fermented feed or what. Cows and certainly feedlot cattle that have been adapted or introduced to silage before just don't have any trouble at all. So it appears to only be a problem for new calves, or if they're really naive and have never, if the cows, for example, have never seen silage, they may need an adaptation to it as well. Okay, so if you look at what is silage, if you go to the NRC and in the data tables that are available in 1996 NRC, there was over 20,000 samples of silage analyzed for these different things that's in that data set. The TDN listed in the NRC is 72% for the energy value of silage. I've given you what that equates to for NEM and NEG if that's of use. But I think that 72 TDN is pretty standard for the energy content of silage. I'm sure that varies from silage to silage, but that's the average that's used. It listed in that publication is also what the average dry matter content was for all the samples that were analyzed, and it averaged just under 35% dry matter. So when we say putting silage up at 35% dry matter is normal or average, this is data that supports that. However, in parentheses, I've got to point out that the standard deviation on that's quite high. Likewise, crude protein was just under 9% with a fairly high standard deviation, at least for protein. NDF of 46 and ADF of 27, and again, fairly high standard deviation. So what does that tell us? That tells us that these are good average numbers to use, but you should really analyze your silage because there's tremendous variation across different silage piles, and that probably relates to how it's put up and how well it's stored. You can also perform what I would call a silage test, which will measure pH and some of the organic acids like lactate and some of the volatile fatty acids like acetate, which can tell you that it fermented well. If you're going to perform that silage test, that should be done at least 21 days post-ensiling to make sure it's gone through the fermentation process. 28 days may even be better. Okay, what about growing cattle? Well, there's not a lot of, I guess it's hard to know how you compare silage to other growing programs, and so there's not a lot of information that just says, okay, this is how silage compares to feeding hay, because that's not really that critical. So I'm going to present a couple of growing experiments we've done. They happen to be with some different genetic traits on corn. For instance, this is a publication from 2002 where we looked at either early maturing hybrids or late maturing hybrids that were BT corn hybrid or a non-BT corn hybrid. Cattle consumed just under 20 pounds, 18 to 19 pounds, and there wasn't any difference across those different hybrids. But you can see that the gains were pretty good. The late maturing hybrid was a little under 3 pounds per day for gain. This is across 84 days. And the early maturing hybrid in this case happened to gain more, 3 to 3.22. And the superscripts there are on there because there was a significant difference across hybrids, but not all that large. And then you see the conversions range from just under 6 to 6.8, and there was significant differences across hybrids, but I'm wanting to give you a feel for what does it look like on average. Now, why did those different hybrids give different performance? This silage was harvested at 3/4 milk line as the target. You can see that the dry matters were just under 40, or around 40 for the early maturing hybrid when it was put up as silage, around 38 for the late maturing hybrid. The proteins were lower than what I presented before, but in the mid to upper 6s. But what probably explains the performance is the fiber content. Notice that the fiber content for NDF and ADF are a touch lower for the early maturing hybrid as compared to the late maturing hybrid. And then I provided the starch content as analyzed for those different hybrids, which didn't vary a lot. So my point is that if silages give different growing performance, it's likely related to the fiber content, which then dictates what the energy content is of the silage. The only other growing study I guess I wanted to mention is one that's more recent, where we looked at 80% corn silage-based diets with 15% wet distillers grains. There were 4 hybrids, and I apologize I got off, but this was a genetically enhanced hybrid, the first column. The parent of that hybrid without the genetic traits, and then a couple of reference hybrids. This is in our 2011 Nebraska Beef Report. And my point is that in this study, again, these cattle were grown in the spring months, from February to May in pens. They went from just over 600 to just over 900 pounds across 90 days. And the gains were very good. We had an excellent spring that year. Well, excellent meaning no rain, which isn't excellent if you're grazing cattle, but was excellent for feedlot pens. And these gains were 3.5 to 3.6 and didn't vary across hybrids. And conversions were very good, again, in the mid to upper fives for conversion. So I guess our point is that you can grow cattle well on a silage-based diet, and we believe that if anything, putting some byproducts with it, in this case these diets had 15% wet distillers grains, makes that growing program even better. So what about for cows? It's an excellent feed for cows as well. It may even be too good, which I'll explain. How it fits for cows depends on the stage of production that they're in, and so they may or may not need protein depending upon whether they're lactating cows with nursing calves or if they're dry. Probably has too much energy in many situations for the cows. If you just fed a straight silage diet, the cows will put on condition, and that's even more pronounced if it's fed with byproducts. You could limit the intake, though, if you wanted to, and so you don't have to feed cows as much as they'll want to eat. You could limit it to whatever level of intakes necessary to meet just their energy needs, but not to put on condition. The nice thing about silage is, especially in cow situations, is that you have guaranteed inventory of feed, and so you have a pretty well guaranteed source of forage, because year in, year out, we're going to get corn production. It's just a question of how much grain's produced. Again, I mentioned this, that drought-damaged corn acres then might be a real fit for this for cows and put up as silage. And we need to price these accurately, as I've described at the beginning and last week, and then price that per unit of energy. So you need to have a TDN content of that silage. Okay, now I want to shift to feedlot cattle then, and this is some historical work from back in the 70s, and just for perspective, grain prices were quite high in that period of time, and so there was a lot of interest on, well, can we feed more silage, because that's what was traditionally done, and especially if grain's expensive. So I want to point this out. This is a nice review by Goodrich, who was at the University of Minnesota from the mid-70s, and what they did is they compiled data where cattle were fed anywhere from 10 to 80% silage in the diet on a dry matter basis, and what happened to gain, intake, and feed conversion. So you can see that the gains tended to drop off as we increased silage inclusion in the diet. Intakes were relatively constant, which then led to poorer or increased pounds of feed per pound of gain as we increased silage in the diet. So there's no doubt that if you take a corn-based diet, which is this one, and replace it with silage, which are these diets, you will decrease gain and hurt conversions. But the questions whether what happens to profitability of the cattle, and you can see from their analysis, which I've given their assumptions on silage and corn price from that period of time, and profit was increased. And so there was a lot of interest in feeding elevated levels of silage with expensive grain. This is some data across 3 different experiments with yearling cattle. This is the average of those 3 experiments. We fed 15% corn silage in the diet, which would be a very traditional roughage level fed to grain-finished cattle. 30 or 45% corn silage, and this is back in the late 90s. And again, we saw a little bit of a change in intake, maybe if anything a little increase as we added silage to the diet. Gains decreased and conversions got poorer. And so again, that's not dramatically different than Goodrich. Now what's different though about those two things that I've discussed and today is that today we have distillers grains. And so we've revisited this, and primarily because we wanted to look at it in diets that contain distillers grains. And so to start that off, this is some work we initiated um, uh, at least in the last 2 years, where we fed diets that had 40% modified distillers grains in most of the diets. But in those 4 diets that had 40% distillers grains, we increased silage from 15 to 30 to 45, and then we just went to 55 because that already took up the entire diet with 40% distillers. We had 2 other diets to compare to, a diet with 45% silage and no distillers, which would match some of the previous data that I just talked about, and then a diet that's a little bit more extreme where it was 65% distillers, mostly because at that time when we started this trial, we thought, well, maybe distillers will be really inexpensive compared to corn, and that would make some sense, but obviously that's changed and not as logical today. So I won't discuss that diet much with you. I want to jump in then. This is looking at the 4 diets with 40% distillers grains in the diet, and silage increasing from 15 to 30 to 45 and then all the way to 55. So what happened? Well, there was a linear decrease in this study. These are with calf feds, which may influence us some, but a linear decrease in intake, a linear decrease in gain, and feed conversion got poorer. Notice that it's about 1.5% poorer than 15% silage when you feed 30. It's about 5% poorer when you go to 45, and that drops off to almost 8% poorer than cattle fed a traditional level of roughage or silage for finishing. And I presented the dressing percent. I just want to point out that as we increase roughage in the diets, whether that's silage or anything else, there is a risk of decreasing dressing percent. So we have to look at this on a carcass-adjusted basis. And that's what I've presented, is only based on carcass weight. So when I say the gain decreased, that's based on carcass weight performance, not live weight. Frankly, what cattle weigh live is not important. It's what the carcasses weigh that's really critical. And you can see what happened to marbling and fat depth, at least with a little bit of a drop-off, at least in fat depth at the high levels. Okay, this got scrunched a little bit, but you can see that for cattle fed the 45-40 diet with 40% distillers grains, the gains were 376 and conversions of just over 6. But if you look at that same diet with 45% silage and no distillers, notice that the gains, instead of being 376, are just over 3.5, so it dropped off, and conversions got worse. And so having the distillers in the diet helps the performance of these higher levels of silage. And so we're currently testing this. This is one experiment that was recently completed, and we have one in progress now where we're looking at 20% inclusion of distillers, because that's probably more typical, and compared to 40% inclusion of distillers with either a traditional low level of silage or a fairly high elevated level of silage to see what happens. And so I guess I want to focus on this. We had a control diet that had just 5% stalks in it to begin with. But if you look at 15 to 45% silage, there was almost a 13% increase or poorer feed conversion as we added silage to the diets with 20% distillers. That was only about 4% increase in feed conversion when we added silage to the 40% level of distillers. So level of distillers is important when we're looking at feeding more silage. So lastly, then, I want to discuss some of the economics, and I think it's important for you to know what we did when we did that analysis. We did basically a budget on the cattle. so these are some of the assumptions we use. The days on feed, we increased the days on feed for the cattle fed higher levels of silage because gain dropped off. So we got them all to an equal final weight of 1,375 pounds. Again, that's carcass adjusted final weight. And we use set of prices on incoming and outgoing cattle. You can see how we price distillers grains, 90% the value of corn on a dry-to-dry basis, shrink on those different ingredients. And I'm going to show you a couple scenarios here where we have 10% shrink and then also 15% shrink. So you can look at that in more detail and pause this if you want to see more details on the economics later. Okay, now we priced corn in these scenarios that I'm going to go through at either $3.50 a bushel, $5, or $6.50, which it appears this year we might see corn that range from almost $7.50 down to at least $4.50 if you look at the board prices. And so this range in price may actually be observed within one growing year, which is just a phenomenal change in price that we're experiencing from year to year here on grain. So we wanted to present it under different scenarios so you'd have as much information available as possible. And as I mentioned before, we used the pricing that we think is appropriate for corn at 10.5 times price of corn at $3.50 a bushel, 9.7 times price of corn at $5 a bushel, and 9.2 when it's $6.50, and that's delivered to the bunk. In the field, that price is 7.65 times the price of corn regardless. And so that difference in prices is basically the cost of getting it to the bunker and packed in. And then I will show you we used either a 10 or 15% shrink, and I'll present it both ways. Okay, so to start off with what I would call, at least compared to recent times, relatively inexpensive corn, $3.50, the appropriate multiplier on corn price. If you look at feeding 15% silage, 40% distillers, and we made those cattle break even, this is looking at the relative change in profitability per head as we go to 30, 45, or all the way out to 55. So it's the same diets that I was presenting before that all have 40% modified distillers. And this is with 10% shrink. So you can see that the profit's slightly higher at 30% silage, and then it drops off at 45 and is actually a negative at 55. Again, that's with 10% shrink, and the cost of gains are provided there. Now, if you look at it and go to 15% shrink, notice the impact that has just on profitability per head, and it's quite dramatic. So this illustrates to me that we need to pay close attention to minimizing shrink regardless of corn price and regardless of silage price, because it can have a big impact on the economics. Now that's all at $3.50 per $3.50 per bushel price on corn. If you jump to $5 per bushel, notice that the silage looks more favorable, and at 30 and 45, there's really no difference. And it tended to be quadratic. We think it's quadratic, but we weren't able to pick that up with statistics done on each pen. And then if you go to the 15% shrink, again, you can see that decreases that profit opportunity of feeding more silage quite dramatically. And so how we manage shrink is critical. And then lastly, looking at what I would call expensive corn, $6.50 a bushel. Again, the appropriate multiplier on corn silage price, and you can see that profitability is increasing. In this case, it was linear. That looks quite quadratic to us, and so my point is that it appears that as corn gets more expensive, there's more profit opportunity for increasing silage inclusion with 10% shrink. And the same holds true, we think, for 15% shrink. But again, notice that your profit opportunities are decreased quite dramatically if shrink isn't managed appropriately. And then all those slides, you can see the cost of gains that we calculate. It's primarily a feed cost of gain with those different diet scenarios. So I guess in conclusion, our recommendation would be to make sure you ensile correctly and minimize shrink, and that we've got to get this pricing appropriate. And it depends on whether you're talking about price in the field, price delivered and packed in the bunker, or price delivered to the bunk. We would recommend getting an analysis post-fermentation, so 28 days post-fermentation, post-ensiling. Minimally, you need to get dry matter, fiber, pH, and protein content. We think it's an excellent feed for growing calves. Those cattle are more efficient because they're growing at lighter weights. They're not more efficient just because of the silage. It's really related to what size they are when they're in the growing program and what weather does and what time of year you're doing it. But clearly, silage is a good feed for growing cattle once they're adapted to it. And combining it with wet byproducts like we have in the state is even better. And so that's something to consider. It's an excellent feed for cows, probably too good, but again, you can limit their intake of it. And again, it's also an opportunity to utilize corn acres that may not yield on the grain side. For feedlot cattle, it may be economical at above normal inclusions being 12 to 15% on a dry basis. It may be economical to go to 30, especially when grain's expensive and we can minimize shrink. If grain was relatively inexpensive again in the future, some of these issues go away and may not be as economical. Either way, silage is an excellent roughage source for feedlot cattle, and again, that would be at a 15% inclusion, regardless of what happens here in the future on economics. So there's a lot of flexibility from year to year in using silage, either at a normal level or at elevated levels if it's economical. With that, that's all I have for comments. Be happy to take questions if there are any, and either today or as follow-up in the future. Thanks.